Step number one in going through this quant sequence is developing a good theoretical model and then developing some hypotheses to represent that model. We can see that step number one is right here in our order of operations section of the wiki. Now the first thing you need to do to develop a good theoretical model is refer to the 10 steps above. I'm not going to go through every single step. That'll take quite a while, and it's context specific to my study, whereas your study will be quite different. But most important, we need to define some dependent variables, choose them, figure out why they're important, and then go from there. I've decided to use a fairly complicated model so that it would be more realistic. I've used in the past very simple models, but they're not very realistic. Your models aren't going to have just two independent variables and one dependent variable. You'll have fairly complicated models like this. So I'll use this throughout. Now this is a model that was built on some data, or out of some data, that was collected at my university, and it's about the use of Microsoft Excel. And we wanted to know how using technology in general, but in the context of Excel, I suppose, would increase information acquisition, the extent to which the system was able to give you good and high quality information, and the extent to which the system helped you make better high quality decisions. We figured there are some things that will affect that, some behaviors like playfulness, the extent to which you play and innovate with technology, comprehensiveness of use, that's the extent to which you use the technology. For example, how many features of Excel do you really explore and utilize? And then atypical use, which is the extent to which you believe your use of Excel or whatever technology is fairly unique and different from what other people do with that technology. So these are things we figured would probably affect your information acquisition and your decision quality when using the system. And then we thought, well, since these are behaviors and these are outcomes, let's mediate those effects by an extrinsic motivator and an intrinsic motivator. So to what extent are the effects of these behaviors to what extent are the effects of these behaviors on the dependent variables mediated by extrinsic and intrinsic motivations, and for which is which mediator more potent or powerful, all while controlling for gender, age, education, and we may also do multi-group moderation using how frequently you use Excel and the amount of time in years you have been using Excel. We figured that both of these things will probably affect your ability to gain good information and make good decisions while using the system. So this is our model that we've developed after looking at those 10 steps. Now, if we want to develop some hypotheses for this model, we have unlimited options here, pretty much. We could develop so many blasted hypotheses. For example, we could do one for every single arrow. Playfulness impacts usefulness, H1. Usefulness impacts information acquisition, H2. But that seems like overkill. We'll end up with like 50 hypotheses. Another way to do this is simply to focus on the mediators and say that usefulness mediates the positive effects of playfulness, comprehensiveness of use, and atypical use on information acquisition and decision quality. Now that's a lot of relationships we're hypothesizing all in one, and what we would do to accommodate that is say that this path here, playfulness, usefulness, information acquisition, that's H1A. Comprehensiveness of use, usefulness, information acquisition, H1B, H1C. We could even do H1D going this way, or we could do H2A to decision quality, H2B. You see what I'm doing? And it still ends up being a lot of hypotheses, but we've consolidated them a bit so that the cognitive load for the reader and for ourselves is somewhat diminished. Now, I also forgot to mention we have interactions. I decided I'm just going to throw everything into this model so that we test everything so that you have a good foundation for every type of procedure you could possibly do in a pretty standard structural equation model. So I'm interacting playfulness and comprehensiveness of use, comprehensiveness is use and atypical use, and then atypical use and playfulness. So every possible combination of the IBs. And I don't think it's a good idea, at least it's not part of my theory, to mediate the interacted effect. So I'm not going to hypothesize that usefulness mediates the effect of the interaction of playfulness on comprehensiveness of use on information acquisition. I mean, that's just a mouthful in and of itself. What I'm going to do instead is ignore this half of the model and just say that the effect of playfulness on usefulness is moderated by comprehensiveness of use. That's my H, whatever, 5, or 4. And then I'll do the same for these interactions. And then with these moderators, these multi-group moderators, I don't think I'm going to worry about all of the mediated effects or the interaction effects, and then I'll have like twice moderated mediation. That'd just be ridiculous. What I'll do is I'll pick a couple of relationships in this model that I think are probably moderated by frequency and experience. For example, the extent to which enjoyment impacts decision quality is probably based on the frequency of your use of Excel. For example, I don't know, I haven't thought through the logic there, but that's one example we could take. And so I would just moderate this relationship here, or maybe all of these 4 here. But I'm not going to moderate the whole model unless that's part of my theory. But that gets fairly complicated when you're moderating mediation, or you're moderating moderation in this example. So I would create a couple new hypotheses that say that frequency of use moderates the effect of enjoyment on decision quality, such that when you have low frequency, the effect is weaker, or something like that. And all of this, of course, is all while controlling for gender, age, and education. Now I've written these hypotheses down here. You can see I have 9 major hypotheses with some sub-hypotheses, A through C, A through B. And these aren't fully written, nicely written hypotheses, but they'll suffice to get the point across. If I were to write these fully, I'd say something like this. Let's see. Usefulness mediates the positive effect of playfulness, comprehensiveness of use, and atypical use on information acquisition. That's probably fine. For a moderation, comprehensiveness of use moderates the positive effect of playfulness on usefulness and enjoyment. Let's see. I should have a positive or negative on this moderation. So let's say positively moderates. That means an increase in comprehensiveness of use should magnify the effect of each of these guys, of playfulness on each of these guys. Let's do a multi-group moderator. Sorry about my emails keep on popping up. Multi-group moderators, I would say something like experience moderates the positive effect of usefulness on IA and DQ such that the effect is stronger for high experience, or something like that. And again, this is all while controlling for gender, age, and education. And that's it. So I don't have 50 hypotheses. Well, actually, I might have about 20. But I don't have 50. I don't have one for every single line. I've sort of consolidated. I'm testing a sufficiently complex model, and that should be fine. I hope that helps. Move on to step 2 next.